Captain James Mitchell's hands were shaking as he stared at the blank screens in front of him. Every navigation system dead. The storm raging outside, making it impossible to see anything through the cockpit windows. And somewhere behind him in the passenger cabin sat his daughter Sarah, who had been fighting for months to get his pilot's license revoked because of his early-stage Alzheimer's, not knowing that her father was the only thing standing between 180 passengers and certain death as he desperately tried to remember landmarks that were now just fading memories in his deteriorating mind. Let us know from where you are watching from in the comment below, and subscribe to our channel, because this story will take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. It had started as the worst day of James's career 3 hours earlier, when Sarah had ambushed him at the airport. Her eyes filled with tears and determination as she pleaded with him one more time to retire, showing him the medical reports that confirmed what they both feared, that his memory was slipping away piece by piece. But James had brushed past her, saying he had a flight to captain and passengers who were counting on him, not knowing that Sarah had secretly booked herself on Flight 447 to Seattle, planning to document any signs of his confusion during the flight so she could finally prove to the airline that her father was no longer safe to fly. The takeoff had been routine, James going through his pre-flight checks with the precision of 30 years of experience, his first officer Mark completely unaware that anything was wrong as they climbed to cruising altitude. But 20 minutes into the flight, the first lightning strike hit, followed by another and another, until the entire electrical system began failing one by one. The GPS went dark, the radio crackled and died, and the backup navigation systems sparked and went silent, leaving them flying blind in a storm that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Mark had looked at James with panic in his eyes, asking what they should do, but James felt his mind racing and then suddenly going blank, the familiar procedures that he had performed thousands of times seeming to slip away like water through his fingers, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't remember if they were supposed to climb or descend, turn left or right, or even where they were supposed to be going. In the passenger cabin, Sarah felt the plane shudder and noticed the worried looks on the flight attendants' faces, her heart sinking as she realized something was seriously wrong, and she found herself praying that her father's experience would be enough to save them all. Even as she remembered the morning 2 weeks ago when he had called her by her deceased mother's name and forgotten they had made plans for lunch. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing himself to remember his training, to push through the fog in his mind and recall the route they had filed. The airports along the way, the mountains and valleys he had flown over countless times, and slowly, like pieces of a puzzle coming together, he began to visualize their position, remembering that they had passed over the Columbia River just before the storm hit, which meant they were approximately 40 miles northeast of Portland International. Mark was frantically trying to reach air traffic control on different frequencies, but all they got was static, while James made the decision to descend slowly, hoping to get below the worst of the storm and maybe catch a glimpse of the ground. His hands steady now as muscle memory took over, even as his mind struggled to hold on to each decision long enough to act on it. Sarah had noticed that several passengers were crying, others were praying, and the flight attendants were moving through the cabin with forced smiles, checking seatbelts and trying to reassure everyone that everything would be fine. But Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, and she wondered if her father even knew she was on board, if he was thinking about her and what might be his final moments as a pilot. As they descended through the clouds, James caught a brief glimpse of lights below, a pattern that looked familiar, and he searched his memory, trying to remember what city it could be, what airport might be nearby, while Mark continued to work on the radio, finally managing to make contact with Seattle Center, who confirmed their worst fears, that the storm had knocked out navigation aids across the entire region, and they were essentially on their own. The fuel gauge showed they had maybe 40 minutes left, not enough to fly around the storm, not enough to make it to their original destination, and James knew they had to find an airport soon, or they would all die. But when he tried to remember the airports in the area, his mind felt like it was full of static, names and runway configurations mixing together until he wasn't sure which memories were real, and which were just echoes of flights from years past. Sarah had unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to the front of the cabin, telling the flight attendant that she was the captain's daughter and asking if there was anything she could do to help. And when the attendant looked at her with surprise and hope, Sarah realized that everyone was counting on her father, the same man she had been trying to ground, the same man whose mind was slowly slipping away, but whose hands still knew how to fly a plane. James spotted a break in the clouds and saw a river below, winding through what looked like farmland. And suddenly he remembered flying this route with his own father 40 years ago. His dad pointing out the landmarks, teaching him to navigate by visual reference. And the memory was so clear that for a moment his mind felt sharp again, focused, and he knew exactly where they were and where they needed to go. He banked the aircraft to the right, following the river toward what he remembered was a small regional airport, praying that his memory was correct, that the runway would be long enough, that the lights would be working. While behind him, Sarah stood in the galley, looking out the window at the storm, thinking about all the arguments they had had, all the times she had questioned his judgment, and wondering if she had been wrong to try to take away the thing that defined him. The airport appeared through the rain like a miracle, its runway lights cutting through the darkness, and James felt a surge of relief and pride as he lined up for approach, his hands moving with the confidence of 3 decades of experience. But as he began his descent, he felt his mind starting to fog again, the approach speeds and landing procedures becoming jumbled in his head, and he had to fight to remember the basics, to trust his training even as his memory failed him. Mark was calling out altitudes and airspeeds, but James was flying by feel now, by instinct, letting his hands and his heart guide the aircraft down through the storm. And as the runway rushed up to meet them, Sarah held her breath in the cabin, finally understanding that her father wasn't just a pilot whose time had passed, but a man whose skill and experience had been earned through years of dedication. And even with his mind failing, his soul still knew how to fly. The wheels touched down hard, but true, the aircraft bouncing once before settling onto the runway, and as James applied the brakes and brought Flight 447 to a stop, the entire cabin erupted in applause and tears, passengers hugging each other and thanking God they were alive, while Sarah made her way to the cockpit door, waiting for her father to emerge. When James finally opened the cockpit door, his uniform soaked with sweat, his hands still trembling slightly, he saw Sarah standing there with tears in her eyes, and instead of the accusation or disappointment he expected, she threw her arms around him and whispered that she was proud of him, that she was sorry for doubting him, and that she finally understood that being a pilot wasn't just his job, it was who he was. And maybe there was a way to honor that while keeping everyone safe. As the passengers filed off the aircraft into the small terminal, many of them stopping to shake James's hand and thank him for saving their lives, Sarah walked beside her father, both of them knowing that this would probably be his last flight as captain, but also knowing that he had ended his career the way he had lived it, as a pilot who would do anything to bring his passengers home safely, and that some things are more important than perfect memory, that experience and heart, and the courage to act when everything seems lost, are what truly matter when lives are on the line.